In 1977, Colorado Springs wasn't yet the sprawling mountain metropolis it would become. It occupied a unique geographical and social middle ground, too developed to be rural, too sprawling to feel urban. Along North Nevada Avenue, fresh apartment complexes rose like hopeful monuments, their concrete and glass welcoming young families, college students, and anyone starting fresh. These weren't high-security complexes with surveillance footage and electronic locks. These were places where neighbors nodded in hallways and parents felt comfortable entrusting their children to responsible teenagers from the neighborhood. In those days, such trust seemed both reasonable and unremarkable. The Sunrest apartment sat nestled in that development, a modest collection of units where people's lives intersected in the ordinary ways they always had. This was still an era when a 14-year-old could earn money watching her neighbor's children on a Monday night, and the transaction between parent and babysitter required nothing more than mutual acquaintance and a handshake. Janie Kuzlia lived in one of these apartments. She was a mother to two young boys, one 6 years old, one 8. Like countless parents throughout history and across all social classes, she sometimes needed an evening away from the responsibilities of motherhood. Maybe it was for a date with her husband. Maybe it was simply to remember what it felt like to exist outside the four walls of her home. For that evening on Monday, February 7, 1977, she arranged for a reliable local girl to watch the children. The girl's name was Maria Loraine Honzell. She was 14 years old. Maria was the kind of teenager parents wanted watching their children. She showed up when she said she would. She was mature beyond her years in that particular way that some young people are. She had an older brother who looked out for her. She came from what seemed to be a stable, caring family. Maria put on a blue jumpsuit that evening, a detail so minor that it shouldn't matter, yet it would become the single most identifying feature of her appearance in every police document, every news report, every remembered detail across nearly 5 decades. When Janie Kuzlia left her apartment that night, the evening unfolded as thousands of similar evenings had unfolded before and would unfold after. The children were still awake. There was TV playing. There was a bedtime story. There was the gentle ritual of tucking young bodies under blankets and extinguishing lights. By the time Kuzlia was truly gone, the apartment had settled into the kind of quiet that comes with sleeping children, and an evening of quiet supervision ahead. At approximately 11:20 that night, Janie Kuzlia turned her key in the lock and entered her home. She was anticipating the simple transaction of paying Maria, perhaps making small talk about how the children had behaved, of returning to her normal evening. Instead, she walked directly into a nightmare that would splinter across decades. She found Maria dead in the master bedroom. The body bore unmistakable evidence of violence, multiple stab wounds to the chest, a particularly brutal, deep wound to the neck. The initial police call logged it as a possible suicide, which speaks to both the shocking nature of what was discovered and the emergency responders' initial attempt to categorize the incomprehensible. But suicide cannot explain multiple stab wounds and the clear evidence of struggle that investigators found in that bedroom. This was homicide. This was an attack. And yet the scene presented its own peculiar contradictions. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered windows, no evidence of prying or destruction. The children in the adjacent room remained untouched, still sleeping, though the younger one, had awakened at some point during the violence and ventured into the hallway. What he witnessed there would become seared into his child memory, a man obscuring Maria's mouth, directing her toward the master bedroom. Then back to safety, back to bed, back to the only survival mechanism a 6-year-old possessed, returning to his sister's side. The autopsy told a clinical story: multiple penetrating wounds, significant trauma, a depth of violence that suggested rage or compulsion or both. But the autopsy also revealed something else: DNA evidence before DNA could be used as a definitive tool. On Maria's blue jumpsuit, there was blood that didn't belong to her. This blood, when later analyzed, showed a male DNA profile. The killer had left behind a biological fingerprint, invisible to him in 1977, but a permanent marker nonetheless. Medical examiners and investigators also found evidence suggesting sexual motivation. The violence wasn't random. The violence wasn't impersonal. This was an attack with intent, with knowledge, with purpose. The initial investigation cast its net among those most likely to have known Maria's movements, the apartment's layout, and Janie Kuzlia's schedule. Police interviewed acquaintances. They explored connections. They filed names and possibilities. One name that emerged was William Kernan, a young man who moved in circles that intersected with Kuzlia. He'd been to that apartment complex before. He'd been interviewed. His DNA was compared against the evidence. But in 1977, comparison meant something different than it means today. It meant looking at limited samples. It meant working with technology that could rule some things out but couldn't definitively connect most things in. There wasn't enough to elevate him to official suspect status. There wasn't enough for prosecution. His name drifted backward into the files, and the case remained open, active in a theoretical sense, but growing colder with each passing month. Maria Loraine Honzell was buried. Her family began the process of learning how to live with an unanswered question. An older brother named David Honzell watched his parents grapple with the loss of a child and the absence of closure. He watched years pass. He watched the 1980s arrive, then the 1990s. What happened next is less about dramatic investigation and more about the grinding patience of time. Police files are transferred between detectives, cases are reorganized. The physical evidence, including that blood-stained jumpsuit with its male DNA profile, is carefully preserved and stored, waiting for a future that nobody could predict. The 1990s brought one significant advancement. DNA technology evolved from theoretical to practical. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation sent samples for analysis. A more complete male DNA profile emerged from the evidence. This profile was submitted into CODIS, the national DNA database that connects law enforcement across states. But for a killer with no criminal record, no arrests, no reason to have been submitted into any database, that search yielded nothing. No matches, no connections. Just a genetic dead end in a system that only works when both the evidence and the suspect are already within its reach. Years transformed into decades. 1977 became ancient history. The detective who first handled Maria's case retired. Younger investigators received the file, passed hand to hand like a sacred object, a reminder of something that remained undone. Colorado Springs grew exponentially. New apartment complexes rose where fields once existed. The Sunrest Apartments itself aged and transformed. The people who lived there in 1977, Janie Kuslea, her young sons, the neighbors who knew Maria's face, dispersed across the country. Everyone moved forward except one person. David Honzell did not move forward in the way that people typically move forward. He did not forget his sister's unsolved murder. He did not accept it as one of life's unanswerable tragedies. Instead, he picked up the phone. Once a week, every week for decades, he called the Colorado Springs Police Department. Not when new leads emerged, not when he had information to share. He called because he understood something fundamental about cold cases. They remain cold, not because evidence doesn't exist, but because nobody cares enough to keep asking questions. In the final 5 years before this case was resolved, his persistence escalated into something almost monastic in its discipline. He called once weekly. That's roughly 260 phone calls. 260 times he had a conversation where, inevitably, the detective on the other end had to say the same thing. "I'm sorry, we don't have anything new yet." The detective assigned to cold cases, Tracy Thompson, would later speak about these conversations with raw honesty. They were heartbreaking. They represented everything that cold case investigations are: hope deferred, questions without answers, families that never get the closure they deserve. David Honzell became the living embodiment of refusal. He refused to let his sister become a case number. He refused to let her murder settle into the forgetting that destroys so many victims. In April 2018, American headlines suddenly focused on California. An elderly man named Joseph James DeAngelo was arrested and identified as the Golden State Killer, a predator who had evaded capture for more than 4 decades after murdering at least 13 people and sexually assaulting more than 50 others. What made his arrest remarkable wasn't traditional detective work. It was something entirely new: genetic genealogy. Genetic genealogy operates on a fundamentally different principle than traditional DNA databases. Instead of comparing evidence DNA against criminals in the system, genetic genealogy submits evidence DNA against millions of ordinary people who have voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to public genealogy websites. These ordinary people shared their DNA for one reason: to discover their ancestry, to build family trees, to understand where their families came from and who they're related to. But genetic genealogy, when applied to criminal investigation, inverts that purpose. It uses the connections between millions of ordinary people to work backward toward the person who left the biological evidence at a crime scene. It's like solving a murder by identifying the killer's relatives, then working through those family connections, age, gender, geography, to narrow the possibilities down to a single individual. The DeAngelo arrest captured the imagination of law enforcement nationwide. Police departments suddenly recognized that old cases that had been stuck for decades, might have solutions if this new technology was applied to their evidence. The Colorado Springs Police Department made a connection. They had a DNA sample. They had a blood-stained jumpsuit. They had 42 years of failure to match that sample against traditional databases. They had David Honzell calling once a week with heartbreaking regularity. And suddenly, they had a potential solution. In 2019, Colorado Springs investigators approached Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in genetic genealogy applications for law enforcement. They submitted the DNA evidence from Maria's blue jumpsuit. Parabon's team went to work, not against criminal databases, but against public genealogy databases. They uploaded the genetic profile. They searched for matches. Matches appeared. The work became more precise, building family trees from the matching results, narrowing by age, by gender, by geography, by profession, by every data point available. It was detective work, but not in the traditional sense. It was the patient, methodical construction of possibilities, each step narrowing the field, each new connection removing uncertainty, until finally a name emerged with unusual clarity. The name was William Charles Kernan Jr., also known as Bill Kernan. Then came the complication that no technology could overcome. William Charles Kernan Jr. was dead. He had died in 2010, 9 years before genetic genealogy was even applied to this case, 14 years before his name would be publicly announced as a suspect. He had lived until age 60-something, free from suspicion, cremated after death, leaving behind no body, no biological material for investigators to directly verify against the DNA evidence. This presented an absolute limitation. Genetic genealogy could point to a name. It could connect that name to the biological evidence with high probability. But it could not do the one thing that legal systems traditionally require: create a direct chain of evidence that conclusively links a specific individual to a specific crime. The District Attorney's Office of the 4th Judicial District undertook a comprehensive review. They examined everything: the genetic genealogy results pointing to Kernan, his documented connection to Janie Kuslea, his history of frequenting the Sunrest Apartments complex, his age and gender matching the witness description provided by the child who had seen the attacker, the absence of any alibi for that night, the complete alignment of circumstantial evidence across nearly 5 decades. They reached a conclusion. They believed that William C. Kernan Jr. was responsible for Maria Loraine Honzell's death on the night of February 7, 1977. They could not prosecute him, they could not try him, they could not convict him, but they could close his case with a classification called exceptionally cleared, death of offender. It's a technical classification for situations where the suspect has been identified but cannot face justice because they're deceased. It's a classification that sounds adequate on paper. It satisfies investigative requirements. It closes a file, but it does not answer the question that haunts every family of a murder victim. Why? Why did someone commit such violence? What was happening in their mind? What can we do to prevent such violence from happening to others? These are questions that only a trial can sometimes address. These are answers that only a conversation, however painful, however accusatory, between victim's family and perpetrator can provide. On May 8, 2024, the Colorado Springs Police Department and the 4th Judicial District Attorney's Office held a press conference. They announced that the 47-year-old case of Maria Loraine Honzell had been solved. Cameras were present. Reporters attended. The media machinery that had been dormant for decades suddenly activated. David Honzell appeared at that press conference. The man who had called once weekly for 5 years. The man who had called roughly 260 times just in that final period, plus countless additional calls stretching back decades. The man whose persistence had kept his sister's name alive when official investigations had grown cold. He said something brief. He said something calm. He said, "I've called them probably once a week for the last 5 years, and they made it happen for us." In those words exists a peculiar mixture of emotions. There's gratitude, certainly. There's the satisfaction of finally having an answer, the name of the person responsible. But there's also an undertone of something incomplete. The answer came, but it came after the person who could be confronted was already dead. The answer came too late for justice, though perhaps not too late for closure. This is where the narrative breaks from traditional true crime satisfaction. There is no moment where the killer is led into a courtroom in handcuffs. There is no jury deliberation. There is no guilty verdict. There is no sentencing. There is no opportunity for the victim's family to look the perpetrator in the eye and express the accumulated rage, grief, and betrayal of nearly 5 decades. There is only a name: William Charles Kernan Jr. There is only an old photograph from 1977 showing a young man with an ordinary face, the kind of face you might pass on the street without a second glance. This is the face of someone who lived 33 additional years after murdering a 14-year-old girl. This is the face of someone who presumably lived among friends, colleagues, possibly family members, for 3 decades without anyone knowing what he had done. This is the face of someone who died in 2010 without ever being questioned about his crime. The investigative record shows that Kernan was a student at a local Colorado Springs college in 1977. He had connections to Janie Kuslea, the woman who had hired Maria to babysit. He had been to the Sunrest Apartments complex multiple times. He fit the profile. He matched the witness description. He left behind the biological evidence. But for 40-plus years, these connections remained dormant, unable to cohere into something that the legal system could act upon. The case is closed now. Maria Loraine Honzell can finally rest according to her family's statement, and that may be true. But rest and justice exist as different concepts. Rest is what a victim's spirit might find when their case stops demanding answers. Justice is what happens when a society holds someone accountable for violence, when a perpetrator faces consequences, when families get to articulate their suffering in front of someone who caused it. Maria Loraine Honzell rests now, but justice remains somewhere in the vast gap between her grave and William Kernan's cremated remains. There is one more layer to this story that cannot be resolved, cannot be answered, and perhaps should not be forgotten. On the night of February 7, 1977, 2 children slept in an apartment while violence erupted in an adjacent bedroom. The younger boy, 6 years old, awoke. He saw something that no 6-year-old should see. A man, a struggle, something terrible happening to the young woman who was supposed to protect him. He returned to bed. He did not sleep through the night. He remained aware, in the peculiar way that trauma works, that something was profoundly wrong. Then police arrived. Then the full weight of what happened crashed down around him. That boy grew up, so did his older brother, who was 8 years old that night. Neither of them can be named publicly as adults. Neither of them has given interviews to the media about what they saw, what they experienced, how their development was shaped by witnessing violence in what should have been safety. The record shows only that they were found unharmed, which is technically accurate. They were physically unharmed. But what they carried forward, the trauma, the nightmares, the imprinted memory of violence that remains unexamined, unresolved, and perhaps unknowable to anyone outside their own private lives. There's a peculiar way that true crime can focus exclusively on the perpetrator and the victim, overlooking all the secondary victims whose lives are damaged by proximity to violence. These 2 children were not the focus of police investigation. They were witnesses, certainly, but by necessity, their testimony was limited by their age and their trauma. They have grown into adults now. The case has been solved, but nobody will ever ask them, how has this shaped you? What do you still dream about? What did you see that night? The technology that finally broke this case open is itself a profound shift in investigative capability and forensic possibilities. Genetic genealogy represents the meeting point between recreational curiosity and forensic science. Millions of people submitted their DNA to genealogy websites for deeply personal reasons, to understand their heritage, to find biological relatives, to construct a narrative of their own origin. Few of these people ever imagined that their genetic data would become part of law enforcement infrastructure. The ethics of this development remain contested. Privacy advocates worry that individuals who voluntarily submitted DNA for genealogical purposes never consented to becoming part of an investigative database. Law enforcement has found an extraordinarily powerful tool for solving crimes, particularly cold cases where traditional investigation has stalled. Families of unsolved victims have found hope where previous decades offered none. The case of Maria Loraine Honzell sits at the intersection of these tensions. Without genetic genealogy, her killer would almost certainly have remained unnamed forever. With it, the killer was identified, though prosecution was impossible because he was deceased. It's a strange kind of victory, obtaining an answer without obtaining justice, knowing the perpetrator's name without being able to confront them, bringing closure to a case, while the victim's family remains unable to witness accountability. The Colorado Springs Police Department, in releasing this case, offered recommendations for families, practical, implementable guidance that every parent with teenage children should consider. These aren't theoretical suggestions. They're born from decades of investigation into what happened and what might have prevented it. First, know the people who hire your children for work. This should extend beyond a casual acquaintance or a friendly neighbor. Ask questions, understand their social circle, know who frequents their home. William Kernan wasn't a stranger who appeared out of nowhere. He was someone embedded in the social network of the woman who hired Maria. He had credibility, He had reason to be in that apartment complex. He had the kind of casual familiarity that breeds false confidence. Second, establish a check-in system. In 1977, this was impossible in practical terms. No cell phones existed, no way to send a quick text message confirming arrival or checking in midway through an evening. But in 2024, this fundamental inability to communicate has been solved by technology every teenager carries in their pocket. A simple text when arriving, a check-in halfway through, a confirmation when leaving. These small touches of connection could potentially prevent tragic outcomes. Third, teach children that they have the right to remove themselves from uncomfortable situations. This is harder to implement than it sounds. Teenagers care about reputation, about getting paid, about not disappointing the adults who hired them. But they should know that if a visitor arrives unexpectedly, if something feels wrong, if a situation shifts in a way that triggers their instincts, leaving is always the correct choice. Explanations can come later, safety comes first. Fourth, for investigators and criminal justice professionals, this case offers a forceful reminder. Every cold case containing biological evidence that has not yet been subjected to genetic genealogy analysis represents an opportunity that is fading in real time. Suspects age, suspects die, the window of possibility closes. The investigation of cases like Maria Honzell's should be approaching genetic genealogy with urgency rather than as a final resort. David Honzell, who spent nearly half a century calling the Colorado Springs police once per week, finally received an answer. He learned the name of the person who killed his sister. He learned about William Charles Kernan Jr., a person he will never confront, never question, never see held accountable. But he received an answer. He received closure of a sort, even if not the closure that justice would have provided. He said, "They made it happen for us." And they did. The Colorado Springs Police Department, the 4th Judicial District Attorney's Office, Parabon Nanolabs, the investigators who refused to let this case die, they all contributed to pulling a name out of a 47-year-old mystery. But the question that ultimately cannot be answered remains. Did it come too late? Did the answer provide closure? Or does it simply confirm the tragedy of delayed justice? Maria Loraine Honzell wore a blue jumpsuit on February 7, 1977. She was 14 years old. She was watching her neighbor's children. She was murdered by someone she probably knew, someone she probably didn't fear. She was stabbed multiple times. She bled on her jumpsuit. She died in a master bedroom, while 2 small children slept in the next room. The name of her killer is now known. He lived 33 years after committing this crime. He died in 2010 without ever being questioned. He was cremated, leaving behind no physical remains for investigators to verify his guilt through direct DNA comparison. This is not a story with a satisfying ending. This is a story about persistence meeting possibility, about technology finally solving a puzzle that decades of traditional investigation could not solve, about a family that refused to accept that some murders don't get answers. And it's a story about a teenager in a blue jumpsuit who will never know that her killer's name was finally spoken aloud, 47 years after she was silenced forever. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about how we investigate cold cases, how we protect our teenagers, or how persistence can sometimes overcome impossible odds, please consider subscribing. Each video in this channel explores a true case, a real family, and lessons that ripple outward into how we understand crime, justice, and the price paid by those left behind. Thank you for walking through this case with me. I'll see you in the next one.